But I hope everyone's well. Dimitri, I hope learning is going well. Jockin teaching, Daniel, Christian, everyone. I'd be curious what anyone's thinking about today. I've been editing papers, trying to get them all together. One on kind of the trade-offs. I'm not going to get this back on. This is literally not going to get back on. We will see on productivity and spending time. So that's been fun. But Mr. Jockin, what you thinking about, Mr. Jockin? How you doing today?
I'm doing well. I finished reading your draft of the Japan essay. So I started it a couple days ago and I finished it today. Um, I'll just for those who don't know, Daniel's working on a draft of an apologetic, basically talking about the superiority of storytelling in anime and the Japanese culture and video games, music, and anime in particular. One thing that caught my main argument, and you have a couple arguments, but one of the main ones is to say the strength of story correlates to the revealing of the art. So the art having a relationship to the story, when there's a strong story, the art can reveal itself. I think it's really interesting from our historian perspective because the major tension or the main challenge of modernist art from basically the Impressionist period on was the context of uh, the academy was the highest level of art was history with the conveying of ideas. So I find that very interesting that now, and the whole project of modernist art was to destroy or to remove or strip away story, and they want the pure form. So that's the truth. So I just find it interesting that your argumentation is to go back and say, no, something's actually was lost. So I just thought that I'll just bring that as a first salvo of interest um, at the point. Because also I'm reminded of my conversation with Johannes recently about one of the ideologies of design is the obliteration of ornament, of memory, and the history. So in storytelling's relationship to all those aspects of it, I think it just is kind of a theme I'm noticing coming up a couple times. And that's all I have. I'll throw it back.
No, I appreciate you checking that out. It was it's funny when you go back and look at all these papers from 5 or 6 years ago, you're like, wow, I really should finish that and, get that all together. But no, I enjoyed that paper. I mean, you know, part of the idea is there's always a relationship between all of the arts. So, when Bach's writing St. Matthew's Passion, obviously it's in reference to the gospel. And when you listen to the music, you can imagine the gospel. And there's this kind of movement between the story and the music, right? And there's this idea of, can you imagine you Mitso writing Dancing Madly for Final Fantasy VI, unless he had the story of Final Fantasy VI to do it, right? Can you imagine One Winged Angel from of Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger? Can you imagine the unbelievable music of Attack on Titan, unless you have someone make the story of Attack on Titan, right? And so the story creates reason and inspiration for the music. Otherwise, if I just took a track like, the opening of Cowboy Bebop, Tank, why would you make Tank, right? And if you heard Tank without seeing the anime Cowboy Bebop, it probably wouldn't hit you in the same way, right? But when you hear the music and you remember the story, you go, wow, dang. And all of these comes to light. And the claim is that animation allows you to tell stories that otherwise would be it wouldn't look very good in real life, right? Like, can you imagine Attack on Titan or Neon Genesis Evangelion in real life, right? It just aesthetically doesn't work. You get lost. It's not easy to get into the work. But animation, as long as you're willing to allow yourself to watch it and don't associate it with cartoon, and there's a long argument in the paper about how it's very interesting that, why is it that Japan was willing to accept what I call, adult animation? I know that sounds XXX, but that's not what I mean. Like using animation for adult storytelling. Whereas in the West, that hasn't been the case unless it's like The Simpsons. It's comedy, right? Like it's not serious, right? That's okay if you're doing BoJack. Now you're starting to see more of it, but I would just argue that's because as you go deeper and deeper into the tensions of the world today and all of the psychosis, then you need everything that you possibly can get. You need the best stories you possibly can tell, and you start swallowing your pride and being willing to accept other forms of animation. Now, some of the animation that's coming out in the West is just nostalgia magic, using people's childhood to get their interest. But the idea really is that because Japan was willing to actually accept, more willing to accept animated storytelling, that unlocks storytelling. Because the kinds of stories you can tell in animation is far greater than in live action. When you do it in live action, it's not as engrossing. Like, can you imagine Totoro Mizuzaki in live action, right? It doesn't quite work. But in animation, it does. And then once story is unbound a little bit from determination, and I'll give it back to you, Mr. Jockin, then you have reason for Joe Hisashi to make The Path of the Wind. You have reason for the merry-go-round of life, right? Because you have that, and then you get a feedback loop because people are inspired by Mizuzaki to then make their own movies, of which then inspire new music and new imagery, on and on and on and on. And I am absolutely suggesting that story has a kind of first mover. It has a first mover. Now, am I saying that there's no such thing as music that inspires a story? No, I'm not saying that has never occurred. Dimitri, you're beautiful. But I am saying that we definitely see the high majority of the time that it is story leads to the music. It goes the other way. But I'll pause and throw it to you, Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please, and then I'll give it to Christian.
Yeah, two notes. One is actually was my other part of my note. The big thing about the live action versus the animation is that animation, the viewer completes it. Technically, that's the key because we're not the emotion, the perception of motion, of the persistence over time is by the completion of the viewer, right? Viewing the frames at a certain time frequency, frequency, right? If a certain frames per minute. And actually I don't know about anybody else, but the recent televisions, like these newer TVs that up-res the frames per minute, the frames per second, it's disconcerting. Has an uncanny valley effect. And it's partly because, quite frankly, we're getting part of our satisfaction of us completing the image, completing the presentation. That live action destroys because that's saying like, no, take this literally. Like you have nothing, you have no job to complete here. It's a similar argumentation in fine art and prior to modernist art, the interest in asymmetrical compositions. Because symmetrical compositions are argued they're more complete, they're stable, but they're actually boring because they don't allow the viewer to complete it because a viewer looking at asymmetrical object makes symmetrical because the mirror symmetry of the person viewing it. So that's an argumentation of asymmetrical composition. The argumentation is the completion, while the artwork is incomplete, the completion is a result from the viewer seeing the art. So I use that same argumentation for animation. It relates to the idea that the human perception of imagination, it's way more satisfying for us to imagine in our head a golden mountain versus actually seeing a golden mountain. Like that's the example classically used in the Phantasms from scholasticism. That we have that power. We can combine things that are unassociated in our minds together. We actually get enjoyment from this activity. Or more importantly, another principle from graphic design Gestalt, when we perceive an incomplete image, like when we see like the knocked out triangle in the circle, like that very famous image of the three circles that have like notch cut out, that the viewer completes it, we get delight out of our perceptual awareness of the edges and completing the lack. We actually get an enjoyment from that satisfaction visually because we're participating with the viewing. That's the way I would interpret this, or how I'm presenting in this case. So that's what I'm saying, like live action. But by the way, I say because Cowboy Bebop had a live action. It failed. So, and actually notice the live actions of anime that are going to be somewhat successful, like One Piece, is when they know they're a live action reproduction of anime and they just go camp. They just go super campy with it. So that's also an interesting aspect. Just to share on those notes. Last thing about, I think the idea of like for music is the motifs, the little motifs. I think of things like Rocky, for example, right? Like the anthem of Rocky. And actually, if you notice it, the soundtrack, what they do is they take that anthem of that representing that character, and then they play it on different tones and motifs and other things so that the whole dimensionality, the multidimensionality of the character is shown through. Actually, it's very important. I think the final song from the Rocky soundtrack, the original one, I forgot if it's called Fanfare or like, basically something along the lines of like what Rocky won at the end. That's very important. And the tone, the tenor is like melancholic, but victory. It's literally in the music composition, you're getting told he lost, but he won at exactly the same time. It's very interesting how in music that storytelling device gets told. By the way, another example, a lot of video games do this. I think probably for economic reasons they do this, but another great example is Final Fantasy Tactics, that soundtrack, where the character, like the same motifs show up in different scenes, and they're using that to tell the story. So this idea of a persistence over change. But anyways, these are just notes to build on. The main idea is that this idea of storytelling a big part of this is the engagement of the viewer. And that's something that animation especially allows you to get access to because it doesn't give you everything up front. You have to participate with it to get the full insight about it. I'll stop there.
No, I think that's wonderful. And I think that, like you're saying, the animation asks you to, it kind of invites you in, right? Because the very fact that it's animated means you know it's not live action, which begs the question, how is what I'm seeing in animation perhaps brought into live action? What are the implications analogically? Like it invites you to consider that, right? Which makes you have to step in it to be that sort of bridge. I think second also too, the paper wants to ask the question, is there a way in which AI is the completion of the freedom of storytelling from quote unquote determination? Because that's kind of the argument, is that animation in a way more so frees storytelling from determination, right? You're not, and is AI the completion of that? That's left to be seen, but there's a way in which actually, if the stories are, because you could argue AI is going to be able to make a Totoro in live action that looks good, right? That doesn't pull you out, right? But if it did that, would it actually nevertheless still be less pleasurable because it doesn't invite you in as much? Is there something about animation that inherently draws you in and gives you that pleasure of connection that even AI could never, ever achieve? That's an interesting question. Of course, AI could simply create animated films more easily, but if it tries to do live action films that in the past could only be done animated because otherwise it wouldn't look good, it wouldn't be pleasing, it wouldn't be enjoyable, then that may set a certain limit. So it's interesting to think that. I think also what you're saying with the motifs, yeah, I always go back to Tolstoy watching Wagner. Michelle, we're talking about anime, so you know it's great. And how Wagner, Tolstoy was like, he really hated Wagner. Like he hated The Ring. He's hilarious. He didn't like Shakespeare either. And one of the ideas, he's like, it's just not good storytelling, dang it. And he didn't think Shakespeare was good storytelling, which is really funny. So there's this idea that there's always been attempts in, say, a Mozart's Requiem. You can argue that these things, but then of course Requiem is latent with Christian symbolism and ideas and the gospel and that story that's coming to mind as people's hearing the music. But there's a notion that opera has had attempts of bringing story more so into music and perhaps been successful in some ways and failed in others. But what's interesting is that animation, I think, can take it to the next level because that gives you complete freedom from the determination. It gives you much more freedom from determination, from having to figure out, okay, how do we somehow make a giant cat with an umbrella in Totoro? How are we going to make it look that way? How are we going to make it actually look believable? Well, you don't have to worry about all that. You also don't have to worry about hiring, it's not like Spike in Cowboy Bebop is a really expensive actor, like Orson Welles demanding way more money, like $100 million and not even doing any acting in Superman 2 or whatever. That you overcome those logistical challenges. Not Orson Welles. I'm sorry. I love Orson Welles. I'm thinking Brando. Brando was apparently really difficult toward the end of his life. Clayton, good to see you. So those questions on like how do we logistical challenges make it more difficult to say do epic storytelling, right? Because of the cost and the time and characters getting older, like a One Piece or something like that. Whereas in animation, it's not so difficult, and that allows kinds of storytelling to be possible that are hard to imagine being possible in live action, at least. I'm not going to say impossible, but practically much more difficult. And if there is an interesting relationship where story inspires or gives reason to create new music, of which then inspires people in hearing that music to make, say, new stories or to become creative, then you get a kind of feedback loop, right? And so it is interesting. And then, of course, the implication for that would be, if there is something perhaps about philosophy that is tied to almost story making and understanding reality, or having different language games by which to understand reality, is this starting to get at, and this isn't in the paper, but is this starting to get at why philosophy and art seem to have an interesting relationship? There's always like, why is it that so many people that do philosophy also do music or who are into other art forms? Is it because actually there is something about philosophy that is storing reality or giving you a story that then creates inspiration, that gives you reason to create images that you otherwise would not have reason to make, or music that you otherwise would not make? I can certainly say philosophy has given me reason to make stories I otherwise wouldn't have made, of which then inspire me to make improvisations on the piano I otherwise would not make. So also this question of animation, because philosophy also is a mental activity that has a certain level of freedom from determination, for good and for bad, and that has to be expanded on. Is that also a reason why philosophy seemingly sometimes, if of a certain character, can unleash creativity? I'm not sure, but I will pass it to Christian here. Christian, it is good to see you, sir. And again, I certainly enjoyed our conversations last week. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, a few things popping into my head. One thing, why is music the most powerful art form to a lot of people? Um, I think it's popularly considered the most powerful art form. I don't know. Maybe I need to think more about that. But I've always thought that in the back of my head for some reason. Um, I'm working on well, actually kind of like a revision of essay, kind of a gonzo creative nonfiction thing I wrote at the beginning of the year about Mickey Mouse. Um, and well, what's interesting, well, no, I won't go into that right now, but one of the interesting things that I thought about while I was writing that originally was how early Disney was not for kids. It was for adults. Um, and actually, I will bring one thing up as I'm talking. It's this early review in Variety magazine of a early Disney cartoon. And the description, well, it's a mix of like the kind of early American, not dialect, what's the word I'm looking for? The way they spoke, which is really funny. But yeah, like adults thought that the early Disney cartoons, I mean, I think it was kind of like more like The Simpsons, where it was for adults and it was considered, really funny. Um, and Mickey Mouse in his early days was kind of a kind of countercultural symbol because he was well, he fits into the lovable rogue archetype within storytelling. But people would write in his name, dissenting voters who were like, disillusioned with politics would, vote for Mickey Mouse as a write-in candidate. Um, but yeah, he was a very Mickey Mouse was a you know edgy character when he first started, and lampooning cultural stuff and uh, cross-dressing things like this. So now I'm curious about when and how and why in American culture animation moved toward a more kids centric medium. Um, it's an interesting question. Yeah, and I don't know. I'm curious about that in Japan as well. I know Japan has always had a very image oriented way of doing storytelling, just like before manga, block prints and whatnot. And I want to say something like something like theater, but with like images or something like this, where they would do like live performances, but like with graphical depictions. I know here's the quote from Variety in 1929. Another of the Mickey Mouse series, captioned The Opry House from Walt Disney's cartoonistic shop. The Opry idea provides for a stage presentment of vaudeville effectively sounded. Sound accompaniment has made the cartoon strips much more valuable, and the comedy point intended is more decided in the building. Some funny stuff here, especially the piano number, which has the instrument given the real planar synchronization, which means they synchronize the sound with the actual animation musically. Surprising in comparison with former silent strips. Um, but yeah, this is I'm going to spend some more time maybe researching and thinking about that. Maybe I'll put that into uh, my essay. Um, and then the last thing I was going to say is I had reached out to this guy, Ashley Vance, who's a popular media producer about technology. He started a new production house this year. and I pitched him some ideas for like kind of sci-fi animation shorts, and he liked the ideas, and he said, "Well, show me some stuff you've worked on." I haven't worked on anything, so I never replied to him. But I want to maybe actually use AI to just render some short story concepts, like really like short shorts, like maybe 5 minutes. Um, but I thought I'd put out there, if anyone's got a creative itch and is interested in doing some creative brainstorming on writing some interesting animated sci-fi shorts, slide into my DMs. And because I'd love to work on that with someone if anyone's interested. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, that is awesome. No, Michelle and I, yeah, I do wonder how many people, it is always easy to say everything AI does is terrible. But then it's like, how many like children's books do moms have that are really awesome that they're going to be able to make, at least for their own family, right? Like using AI or different things, that's a positive thing. I am also hearing reports. There's that one guy, I forget his name, talking about people using AI who can't afford a lawyer to avoid eviction. So there are positive things. And I'm trying to not watch the data centers go up and et cetera. But so it's all interesting. But yeah, it's very interesting. Like you're exactly right. Japan scroll, the history of the images. Like there's a name for these. Like actually, very much a kind of image. Much more image based, I think, is very fair to say. And that definitely can be part of perhaps the absorbing of the acceptance of animation, certainly. And the paper, like, again, the main claim of the paper is indeed this idea that animation unleashes storytelling. And the more acceptance there is of animation, the more kinds of stories that become possible. And if story has a unique way of inspiring creators, it's actually a very interesting point on the idea that music is the most popular. That's probably true. Just hearing that sounds correct to me, or at least it's the one that people do the most often, perhaps. It would be interesting to think about like that. But then it's also interesting, like there's a claim in the paper that if story is in decline, and of course it has to be argued what that means, we should expect more and more lyrical music that has lyrics in it, because that's going to give a story in the music as opposed to instrumental music. Like I think the loss of instrumental music coincides with the loss of story, because instrumental music, you can just remember the story that goes with the instrumental, right? And I think we see this with the popularity of some movie soundtracks, Star Wars, etc., so forth, right? But there's tons of instrumental animated music I adore and listen to, and there's no lyrics in it. But then, of course, you can even say what eventually starts happening is then they just use, lyrics become now just phrases that emotionally emote, because you hear a phrase that associates, and the music becomes more and more compressed, and then the lyrical content even just becomes a associational reaction or something like that, right? But I'll pause and give it to Daniel. It's the idea that story uniquely inspires, and then also your as a consumer, your ability to create creative works with story, make them things, I would say, actually make your consumption more nutritious too. I think it actually can be more nutritious because you go into memory. It's not just kind of the music. It's not just art that gives you a kind of a reaction. I want to say dopamine, but everyone says that, where you're just kind of getting lost in it. Like there's actually something where when you have art that makes you think of story, since it pulls you into memory, I think that can be healthier. We talk all the time about the importance of memory. And when you have art that actually makes you go into memory, that may make it actually more on a, I want to say, nutritious side of things. But you need story for that. And then, of course, the claim is that there's something about philosophy that creates a sense of story, then that might get into why philosophy can, people who do philosophy can also be in the arts and different things. I'll pause. I have to think about that point, but let me pass it on to Daniel. Daniel, it is wonderful to have you. Thank you for coming, sir.
That's wonderful to be always, Dan. Daniel, The It's a lovely topic, art. And my mind often goes to, well, like the function, or what's the purpose or the role of art. Um, I think Daniel, you mentioned to me in a conversation an account that uh, it relates to another another idea that I'm pulling from somewhere else, but like, what is the purpose of an artwork? Like, what is it function? Is it trying to do something? Is it not trying to do something? Is it for the one who consumes or witnesses the artwork? And then if it is for the one who consumes it, or the consume is probably not the best word, but if it is for the viewer or for the subject, then in what way is it for? And then how do we say if it's good? Can we say if artwork is good or not good? What is the good artwork? So I think the piece that independently came from you, Daniel, and another a theory of tastes, Russ's. Um, this so what's the universal aspect of the artwork? Is it the idea is that it's um, like the conversation we had is that it strikes something particular in the individual, an emotional quality that draws them, but it translates that particular quality into a universal experience, and that is like the metabolizing work that the artwork does. Then you could even say that there might even be like some kind of formation of uh, a commons or a common body or some communality by that universalizing of a taste. Or but so that's on the on the periphery of my thought. I also just want to like plug a thanks to Thomas Jockin for the way that he's been um, articulating perception, phantasm, and the heart. And I think the way that Thomas, you just expressed our enjoyment, say, in something like anime, in that we complete the image, and this is a unique capacity that we have, and that might be the place of our enjoyment, is that we do have this capacity to somehow conglomerate or amalgamate what comes in via the senses into um, an image of sort. And when I've been thinking about this idea, it's very much the heart that seems to be that place in which the image resides. So the resonance happens, or it's brought together there. Then if you think about something like purifying the heart, or if the heart can have darkness in it, that's an interesting frame. Like, what does it mean to uh, refine perception, or to open the heart? Does art have a role in that? And then there's, I see Michelle is here as well, and this kind of now goes into something that often comes up for me in the consideration of, well, philosophy and art. Something like if I were to phrase it, it would be self-sense artistry, or the artistry of one's self-sense, which we can identify as being unified in the heart, because that's where it comes together. But what does it, the broad areas, like what is it to participate in an artwork? Or, and again, like in the rough areas, like the function or the purpose of, so how, like, if anime is powerful, and I agree, Daniel, in that it really unleashes storytelling capacity, because you're not limited to the forms that you can record. You can play, and then you're not only playing with that in a static image, you're playing with that in a moving image. You have the addition of music. So it really opens up new potential space. But then if you imagine, like, imagine if you push that, and people do, like, push that into really if you pushed it abstractly, like what kind of forms would it be producing? Now, now it seems to be like coming closer to the movement of music, or the movement of in terms of like an outward view, a human body in relationship to the movement of music. Then this self-sense artistry is coining a term, like the how much should maybe I'm just saying a wish. I wish that this could be more of the art that we do. So like a story, is it about just producing ever new stories and valuing novelty, or is the value of the story in some manner of remembering? And so then the story in some sense can be repeated, but the value of the story is the capacity to participate in it. And then participating in the story in some kind of um, um, I guess ritualistic art form, then how do we think about that in terms of its goodness or its purpose for the one who it's for the individual? Like how the I guess my mind is always going in that direction. And that's where this idea of like self-sense artistry um comes in. But let me pass back.
No, that's magnificent. And it's very interesting as you were speaking. Like there's a few things that come to mind, like on this question of when is something music? And I see Clayton's fascinating comment on Levin, where microorganisms are responding to music. Is something music that can pull you in? Like the problem with, say, noise is that it doesn't pull you into participation, right? And what's very interesting to me is my favorite music, because I'm always very interested. So there's a few things. I'm always very interested on instrumental music versus lyrical music. And I know I've already mentioned that, but for example, like I never listen to music with lyrics if I'm writing or something because it's getting in the way of my mind, right? Like I prefer instrumental, right? Even almost like often actually just kind of on repeat, say Tavern, something by Tavern or Richter or Zasi or something. And also, there's a difference between music in a language you know, say English, or music in a language you don't know, like German or something, right? Like if you don't know it, like the experience is very different, right? What is the difference in the experience? When a song has lyrics, it certainly does not feel like it's pulling you in. Like it's doing all the work for you. It's telling you what you should be thinking about. It's giving you the story. It's giving you the emotion. It's generally more top down, I want to say, for good and for bad. I'm not saying I'll listen to South City Midnight Lady by the Doobie Brothers any day of the week, right? So it's not necessarily lyrics are bad, but it's a different experience, right? Whereas when you get great instrumental music, there's a certain pulling you in that occurs. And I think the key on one of the reasons we love music that we can associate with story is because it's not just us remembering the story, but our experience of the story as well, right? It actually is a drawing us into that is occurring, right? And I want to associate this drawing into with what Jockin's been saying about coming before the eyes, right? Like something comes, but there's a similar training or a similar sort of experience that is going on there, right? Like when you hear, like if I'm thinking of the themes like Rocky, when you hear the Rocky music, now you see Rocky, right? It comes before the eyes per se, right? Or at least is associated before the eyes, right? And that is a similar motion. I don't want to say it's identical because now I'm thinking about the difference between coming before the eyes and kind of just associating before the eyes. But it at least has a similar training of a certain motion that is occurring, right? Where what is coming to you is more in you versus external, right? Like it's something that the thing that you are witnessing is oddly internal, right? Like there's an internal witnessing that is occurring, which should be a contradiction. How do you see something inside of you, right? Well, we've all done it. You've been reading a book and had a movie playing in your head, right? We've all listened to music and seen something, right? Like how do you witness, and I'll give it to Clayton here. How do you witness something inside of you, right? Like that's the weird thing that seemingly art can make possible. And then what's just very interesting to think is there something about music, because I am thinking now about what Clayton was saying there on resonance and frequency. Is there something about music that is uniquely participatory. Like something becomes music when it brings something before the eyes versus just noise. Like, is there something there? Like, or like, is it music instead of noise once once it draws you in? Like theoretically, if you could hear the dropping of a squirrel running across the field and the wind blowing, and that drew you into something, then that might be music. Because there's always that question: is John Cage 433 is that music or is it not? Right? Avant-garde. At what point is avant-garde not music or something like that? Right? And perhaps it is something about this drawing in, and something isn't complete unless there is a coming before the eyes or drawing in. And Michael, good to see you. We're talking about anime. So this drawing in and coming before the eyes. I'm thinking about that more and more as perhaps having something to bear on this question of what is art. On this drawing before the eyes, and music has a certain completing, and how that if you don't think about the coming before the eyes or drawing in, you just kind of get lost in this ever deferral of the question. But I'll pause and throw it to Clayton. Clayton, it is beautiful to see you, sir. Good to have you.
No, good to be here. Good to be here. I'm glad I could make it this time. Yeah, so much you've all shared there. Like it's buzzing me, and it has like I've resonated with it to the level now I feel called to participate. And I think like drawing on that thread and trying to push it as far as we can. Yeah, there's a lot in there. Like going to what Daniel was saying about what Jockin said about the image kind of like calling us to complete it. I think that's really fundamental, because like I've been thinking a lot about the whole resonance thing, and when you combine resonance with relevance realization and participation, when you put all those things together, I have a weird radical proposal here, but I'll throw it and then I'll go back to what I was saying. So the proposal is that we as a self, we are an emergent property of a body, like a body which is by body I'm meaning like a coherent system, right from the different levels, like from the cellular level to organ level to system level. It's like there's a certain resonant coherence happening in all those systems that then leads to the relevance of having a certain kind of external awareness of the environment that allows you to gather data, and so you can be in resonance with what is outside of this unit, because the unit has already automated and cohered to the level that it can operate independently. But then as a collective, it can't anticipate what's beyond its embodiment, and so it requires some sort of like steward to interface with what's external to it. And so my proposal is that steward thing is like a self, but it's like it's a partner with this being, and they work together. Like that steward has to sustain this structure because it's an emergent property of it, but it sustains it because the structure caused it, and so they have some weird dynamic. Anyway, I'm still working on sort of putting it into a paper or a Substack. We'll see. But basing off of that, like both you Daniels have said about the incompleteness, like it's strange. Like we, like the thing we don't feel like we can contribute to or we can participate in, we sort of ignore. Because if you go back to Viveki's relevance realization, it's kind of like the thing that process is doing, it's showing you what you can potentially participate in and what you don't need to participate in. It's like, how am I gonna participate with this table? Well, I'll place my computer on it. Right? Okay, so there's an opportunity for me to complete that, right? How am I going to participate with that tree. And you kind of go like, no opportunity for participation there, therefore ignore the tree completely, focus on the table, because table I can participate with. And so when you keep looking at it from that sense, it kind of like starts to spiral. Like even when you go to the music, it's like the music has a certain pattern. And Daniel, you said, depending on which language, which kind of music, like we don't resonate with all musics like this. We all have our music. I mean, if you go to, what's his name, Steve Jobs, he had this thing about the iPod, and everyone's iPod is very sacred to them because they have worked so hard to curate their music, and and the reason you curate your music is because this is going to Michael Evans stuff, like you have a certain resonance. I mean, people will say energy. It's like you kind of like resonate at a certain frequency, and every now and then when you're in response to that frequency, you sort of like, the attraction, like it attracts you to it. You kind of go like, I don't know why, but kind of like feel, oh wait, more of a vehicle language, voluntary necessity. You kind of like feel there's a voluntary necessity that you can't shake off, that is sucking you in, and you can't articulate it, but you feel you have to do it. And so when you string all those things together, it's kind of like there's kind of like a lack that's been presented to you, and you have the other piece, and you're being called to fit that missing piece. And so I feel like art is really beautiful because it does it without being very, how can I say, like, it doesn't compel you directly. It compels you like subconsciously. It kind of goes like, well, here's a resonant pattern that you could map to. Go ahead if you like. And then you see it, and then kind of goes like, wow, it speaks to me. It like I really feel like, oh my God, wow. And like you see that, but I'll see something different. I'll go like, really? You see all of that? I don't know. Like I'm not seeing that. Like I'm not feeling it, feeling it, right? Like I'm not getting it. And so it's like you have all these participation calls, and yeah, wow. It sort of like calls you into participating into that larger form, and then the experience of that is like more completion, right? Like more completion. Like if you have a partner, you you kind of like realize that, like if you're married and you have children, like over the years, like 10 years later, you kind of like get it. You go like, oh wow, my life is more complete because of participating in this way, and here's how it has become complete. Otherwise, it was never going to be possible if I just stayed by myself. And so, yeah, sorry, I know I've said a whole bunch of things and I've been all over the place. I'm going to cut it off there and give it back. Thank you so much.
No, fantastic. And I look forward to that work. That's very interesting on the idea of the body stewarding us of this kind of stewardship. I'm quite a fan of stewardship language. I think there's a lot there. Mr. Luber, is good to see you. We're talking about anime. So, and actually, I think about a lot of that paper on the Japan stuff actually makes me think of your work, because there's an argument that story becomes a kind of first mover in actually, creation, as in the music and the imagery, et cetera, so forth. But as you were speaking too, like there is something like, I also think that idea of you find a certain completeness once you let yourself participate in something that then determines you, right? Like once you're married, you then, like, the marriage ain't gonna go well if you determine everything that occurs, right? That would be tyranny. That would be bad, right? You have to give yourself over to it, right? And you actually find a certain completeness in it. Well, I think the same thing happens with music, actually. Like, because if I actually find there's an interesting thing where I couldn't argue this with authority. But I find people who are very particular about the kind of music they listen to, like it's like what they like overly emphasizing what they like. No, of course there's a certain level of music reflecting ourselves, Danielness. But there's also something about, and maybe here there's the difference between coming before the eyes and preference. Because that would be interesting to think. Like, what's the difference between your preference of music as opposed to the music that you resonate with and thus prefer because it makes something come before your eyes, right? Like, there seems to be a difference there. Like, I've actually found that people are very preferential about the kind of shows they watch, the music they listen to. I don't experience those people as very often being the kinds that are ever taken up in the art, like that they've really been struck by art, actually, or struck by beauty or certain things, like that preferentialness is something very problematic too. Well, if there's something about completing that requires you to give yourself over to something, like you say in marriage or relationship, well, that would make sense because actually, for the right relation with art, you actually have to give yourself over to it, right? But then here's the paradox. How do you give yourself over to art if there's if you choose the art you listen to, right? Or that you watch, how do you do that, right? This is a very weird paradox. But to me, of course, I associate with the paradox of prepared versus planned. Like, how do you prepare for that which you don't know is going to occur? That seems impossible, right? And yet that seems to be completely necessary for the formation of the subject or the human being to be full. There is something now, as also, before I keep going, I'll give it to Jockin here. Is something art that calls you to complete it? Like, if it never calls you to complete it, then it's not art, and art is that which calls you to complete it. So it calls you to complete it, and now I'm wondering the difference between art as that which calls you to complete it and the strike of beauty. Like, that art has this sort of pulling you in, but beauty has this strike that also pulls you in. Maybe because art has a motion similar to beauty, this is why beauty and art overlap, or can, at least in the mind. There's seemingly distinctions. But maybe art is that which calls you to complete it. Or that which we can refer to as an art form or needing skill or art form to think. I'm not sure. I will pause, though, and give it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, please.
The concept that Clayton's bringing up in design is called affordances. What that means is objects afford themselves certain relationships of activity with other entities. Meaning, a bumblebee has an affordance to a flower very different from us, right? So thus, and actually, that actually leads to other Daniel's point about what is the function of art. That's actually another way to put this is what is the affordance of art? What is the affordance? How do we as human subjects relate to the art? Right? That's different because technically, for anybody else, that's not a object of a soul, the logos. Art is just nothing. It's actually vapor in the sense of like it's just a bunch of pigments or a bunch of noises. Actually, I'm not kidding. So that's actually blowing my why is music for us? Because we have a certain dispositional affordance and relationship to it. It has to be certain hertzes of certain frequencies at certain speeds. If they're not within those boundedness, it's unintelligible to us. So this is partly in terms of asking the questions about the bringing before the eyes and preference. Well, that's kind of the point. Preference is basically a self-affordance of a certain delimiting. You're in a self-enclosure, as opposed to the strike of beauty. It's actually the whole point is that it breaks you out of that. It's like I didn't even think that was possible. When in fact, right, Daniel, your note in the anime paper, art expands the possibility of rationality. This is exactly the point, because we're the animal of logos. We are the animal of logos. So we're the one where art has that's why art has a relationship to nature. For us, it's pure. It's basically extracted, reified nature that's being presented to you, right? So thus, the same encounter you could have with beauty in the natural world, you can get an even more reified, precise, but almost like this is always the nuance. It's like it's kind of like similar with food, right? Where we have this while our biology's been screaming for fat, sugar, and protein for millennium, and then civilization got to the point where we're so good at it of extracting from nature that those qualities we're looking for. So obviously this is with a huge caveat, but what art is supposed to do is a more reified, it's drawing out of this quality of beauty that nature can afford to us by a strike of the other onto us in a new apprehension of a possibility. Which also leads to the other point is that the whole problem with art is that these powers can be manipulated immensely and actually more dangerously because attention's being messed with. So that's, I think, another aspect just to think through. I'll stop there.
No, magnificent. And then like the claim also, and then I'll give is that art expands rationality. So then, if that because art expands the non-rational and the true, what is rational is relative to what we believe is true, and art helps us think things that could be true that otherwise we could not think. If storytelling, if animation unlocks storytelling, then also it unlocks horizons by which we can determine rationality. So this would also be arguing that reductions in story, if story has this way of unleashing the arts of which are non-rational and expand the horizon of rationality, then we should actually expect more game theory problems with decline of art. And that animation could actually, in unleashing story, actually help with game theory problems like Nash equilibria or other rational impasses and et cetera, so forth. I think this point on affordances is very, very important. And that then, well, again, if we understand that we have to meet certain conditions to have certain experiences, then a lot of life becomes actually kind of, I want to say, the mystery of figuring out how to gain those affordances, how to meet the conditions to have these experiences. There's a kind of mystery to things because it is not self-evident how one would go about doing that, right? But then this gets into things like virtue, etc. But I will pause and throw it to Mr. Luber and then throw it to Christian. Mr. Luber, thank you for coming, sir.
Thanks for having me. I haven't had a chance to read your article yet. I will. I'm prepping for shooting this film this weekend, which has been a nightmare, like it turns out to always be. And I have so much to say with I just jumped on the call and it's just like right at the heart of what I think about so much. So okay. Couple things. First note on the relationship between preference and witnessing. I like Jockin privately, messaged me and Javier about basically the difference between witnessing beauty and consuming beauty. And I think the relationship between preference and witnessing is very interesting because you have people like Quentin Tarantino, for example, that say things like watch a lot of movies and just steal from them, essentially steal from them, and it works. You see Kill Bill, and for example, he steals a lot from different karate movies that he likes, and he explicitly talks about how he steals from it. What's interesting though is the ordering of each particular preference or each particular piece of inspiration and how that gets ordered and presented in your story unlocks a different feature than what the initial inspiration or premise gave you. That is what's interesting. So it's not that the preference steals. It's not that the preference takes over how your rendition of that basically you get a certain inspiration and it's like, oh, I want to make something like that. Well, the thing is, if you make something just like that, then you're not really being a storyteller or artist. And you're not actually letting thought come to you. You are dictating thought in that sense. So what's really interesting is you get inspirations. And you see this with the philosophical work where not to use Jockin and you, Daniel, as an example, where it's I feel like you guys, for example, will ping pong off each other, inspire each other's work that unlocks something different based off of your particularity that illuminates the other, and it's just this back and forth. And I think what the relationship between preference and the particular beat of the story that the preference is based off of, what that really shows is that there really is no such thing as an individual storyteller, that everything is inherently collaborative, and that when you really tap into what a preference actually is, you actually unlock something that's completely other than the preference, but yet it's totally based on the preference. And there's a method to that. I think there's a method to that. After a certain while in philosophy, when you read a lot and you kind of get your own thought and you listen to other people talk and you read other books, once you've already kind of established your own thought, or in other words, your own thought has come to you, you kind of start to get an ear for when something is said or when you read something that fits within the map that kind of came to you. And it's something that you can create a method for, but only for those who have already done the work. So the tricky part about this, which is the problem of what's the importance of philosophy, for example, is you really won't understand any method. You really won't understand any kind of understanding about that particular topic unless you've done it yourself. And like the question to me is not necessarily like, why is that your particular thought or that particular beat in your story or that particular story, but what made you do it in the first place is a complete mystery. And how to actually teach, basically making people do things that they otherwise knew not to do. That is the golden question that it hurts my head to think about, to be honest, because the only thing that I can think of in comparison is like when I was like 8 years old and my parents forced me to play tennis. Like when your parents force you to do something and then you fall in love with it after the fact, kind of thing. It kind of reminds me of like arranged marriages in a certain way, where like there's something to that. I think I guess my question is, how does one not get caught up in the preference insofar as they're not able to make their preference their own, which unlocks something different than what the preference gave them? That to me is the question, and I think I'm a little biased. I'll go to the answers with beauty, because you have a certain virtuous disposition that allows you to have a certain orientation that you're open-minded. There's a certain open-mindedness to it. Yeah, there was a lot said there, and I gotta think on it. I'll probably raise my hand a little down the line, but yeah, thank you.
No, fantastic. And I'll give it to Christian here. I think this point of each ordering changes it, like this idea of quick Tarantino stealing, but actually it is very interesting because it is not the same. The ordering matters, right? How the thing is put together changes things. And I think honestly, when you look at, you just don't see very often, I don't want to say it never occurs, but often great artists, great minds, great intellectuals are in groups, right? Bloomsbury, Apostles, I can go on. Surely they are stealing from one another. Surely they are, basically where one's thought begins and the other ends becomes very difficult to identify, right? I think it would be interesting, though, to kind of ask the question of, well, surely there is such thing as real stealing. What is that? Like, when is there true stealing in creativity and arts, as opposed to this reordering that actually unlocks another artistic possibility, right? I think basically answering that is going to be tied to an identification of the subject themselves who did the stealing, right? It would be difficult to accuse someone like T.S. Eliot of stealing, even though The Wasteland, in a sense, he was actually accused of stealing, because The Wasteland is full of so many illusions and different things. But it just doesn't seem proper to say T.S. Eliot was a thief, because you go, well, he's a quote-unquote genius or whatever, right? But if I said Bobby was a thief, that would seem more plausible, right? And isn't that interesting? The question becomes, why? Why is that? I'm not sure, but I was thinking that as you were speaking, and I really like this question you were posing on how do you make preference become witnessing, right? Because there is a way that witnessing has to reflect something like preference. You know, clearly witnessing entails preference, but preference doesn't necessarily entail witnessing. It kind of makes me think of the ordering point, because if you said that there are some preferences that can't be ordered into witnessing, that seems to be imposing a meta law or a top-down claim. It would also limit creative possibility. So it would need to be the case that any given preference could be ordered into witnessing, or that would be a limitation on possibility and perhaps beauty. But then, of course, the question is, what exactly occurs when preference is ordered into witnessing? And like you mentioned, beauty. It is also incredibly interesting to inquire into what gets one started into, say, making art or creativity, as you were pointing to, right? Like what that first step. It does seem to be something like, for some reason, when one was 8 years old, they had the experience of something coming before the eyes. They had the experience of that kind of intellectual act, which you could say, you know, they had an experience of just finding themselves in the story of the Sword of Tribulation and walking in the woods for a very long time. You know, I would sit in the back of the bus and never talk and just look out the window and think about things. You know, if you've had that experience, like if you're young and you've had the experience of something coming before the eyes, and thus you know it is possible to have the experience of something coming before the eyes, well, then you may behave and act in a way differently, of which makes it happen more so as you go forward, or you may look to do it. It is very interesting to ask that question. And then, of course, if you inquire into that, is there a way to increase the probability that it occurs for someone? I'm not sure. I will pause and I will throw it to Christian. Christian, thank you, sir.
Can you say precisely what you mean by preferences being ordered into witnessing? I mean, I think I get the gist, but I'm trying to understand why that choice of words.
Basically, what I meant by that is, you get inspired to do something. What makes that, what you're doing, different than the inspiration itself is vis-a-vis the witnessing. Like, what makes you not just repeat or imitate exactly what inspired you? That's what I mean. Like you're essentially, if you're just, and you see this a lot on the internet, where it's just like you're just repeating trends. You're literally just repeating trends for views. I would say there's no witnessing at all, and it's just pure repetition. It's pure, I'm just repeating the inspiration to the T. Like, there's nothing that's calling forth to you that makes you do it in a different way that's your own. That's what I mean.
So if maybe you can like use a example of when this is when something has been, when a preference has been ordered into witnessing.
I got you. I've had this conversation with Eber about this. He has a song called Truth, where there's this whistling component in the song. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Okay, well, basically, okay, you know the song Kill Bill?
Yep.
Where it's like that whistle?
Yeah, it's a great whistle.
Right. That's not original. That was him stealing from I think an old French movie where there's this guy whistling. Now, he put it in a situation that was so utterly different that it just became its own thing. Then there's people that have made that whistle into a song, into remixes and songs, that it's its own thing. Like, you can point out the inspiration, but you recognize it as its own thing at the same time. So think about any classic song, like Eminem, Please Stand Up. Like, that was a sampled song from, I forget this guy, what's his name? But you can hear like the like that the musicality, how it's the same thing, but it's tweaked in such a way that you don't really recognize it as, oh, it's that one song that they're remaking. It's Eminem's song. That's what I mean by that. I hope that makes sense. I can come up with a lot of examples. I just don't know your background and like from a cultural standpoint of what you're.
No, I get that part of the conversation. I got it. I was just intrigued by the phrasing, preferences being ordered into witnessing, and I was trying to understand how you came to that specific phrasing.
Sorry, like the order part, just to elaborate on that, it's to go back to the Kill Bill thing. In the movie, the girl with the one eye patch, I believe, is walking down the hallway whistling because she's trying to find Uma Thurman to kill her. Now, that situation is completely different than the situation that the original whistle tune was from. Now, what I mean by ordering is how you position the whistle in the situation is an order choice. Like when he was making that scene, there was a blocking note where it's like, at this point of the walk, you begin to whistle. The whistle will carry through to this point, and it ends at so-and-so point, and it ends there because of this reason. And if I could recall correctly, I'm pretty sure it ends when she realizes that she's not in the hospital bed anymore, that she woke up from the coma. So you got the vibe like, oh, this person is like bad news finding Uma Thurman, and then the whistling stops, which kind of solidifies that notion of this girl is up to no good. So there was a complete ordering choice based off of what Quentin Tarantino wanted to evoke in the story, and that was completely intentional. And that there's a method to that madness. That's all I was saying, and I can elaborate on that method, but I don't want to like take up your time.
I get the ordered into witnessing. So then when we say preference, that just means a preferred aesthetic object, something like that.
Yeah, I would say it's a preferred aesthetic object, but it's something that like if you talk about the order and preference, it's specifically like it's an aesthetic object that calls out to you, where you're like, oh, I can use that for this, and like you aren't just repeating it. You're taking it and putting it in a new context.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. All right. I get it now. Thank you for helping. And I don't know that I like something about that turn of phrase. So thanks for fully unpacking it for me. And maybe I'll get back to it when I share some of these thoughts. I forget where this came from, but an interesting question I had recently. This was somewhat prompted by I kind of recall Sam Harris when he's talking about his kind of like moral ideals, something to the extent of like, if we could find a technological solution to suffering and well-being and social harmony, we should do that. We should basically like eliminate suffering globally, and then we would just be able to explore the flavors of bliss with arts and things like this. But that always strikes me as a little strange, because my intuition is that art and suffering go together in a very deep way, and that there's even when art is like very much it's all kind of always recreational to some extent, but let's say even when it's not entirely profound or something, I think it's let's say when it's like mere entertainment, even if that's not a good medicine per se, it's still performing this therapeutic role. And I kind of just wonder like what when we ask this question, like what motivates us to make art, it's hard for me to imagine being motivated to make art in some type of utopian setting. I don't. Even something that doesn't have like something very celestial, something very like a very heavenly Bach composition. It's even that. I mean, why do we love Bach? It's not. I don't think it's just that we like math or something. There's more to it. And why would we like a heavenly music? Well, it for a moment it gets us back in touch with something holistic after feeling the pain of our earthliness, right? The whether that's the kind of real pain of the hardness of life and the that kind of suffering, or it's the banality, or it's the sense of limitation, or whatever it might be. So I don't. It's hard for me to imagine, well, utopia at all, but much less any motive for making art within a utopian setting. And then I was thinking, this is something I've thought about, and it's quite speculative. But when Thomas was talking about, the anthropological roots of art, I I don't know if this has much juice in it, but I've always wondered that same question, like what are the origins of music, basically? And we can only speculate, but I think good guesses are something like imitating what we find in nature, imitating bird song. I think probably any type of like percussive music is going to be pretty biologically rooted. I like to say like the very first instrument we ever play is the drum when we're kicking against our mother's stomach in the womb, like we're like bang bang banging around. And then when we're born, we're singers, right? We're already crying and cooing and making often very musical sounds babies make. It's not just like bleh. It's like, well, there's a musicality to it. And then I always love to see like when a baby or like a toddler who's like recently learned to stand, they already have the instinct to dance. You put on some music and then they start pumping their little legs like and I wonder, like, has that always been the case? Has there been is it a genetic adaptation? Is it a morphic resonant field, or I don't know, but I'm like, we're early babies dancing right when they can stand up. That's an interesting anthropological evolutionary question I've always wondered about. But one trend, and this is the speculative thing that I see, is like I feel like at least part of the story of music is that we are as the art responds to technology, where as we become industrialized in the broadest sense of the term, like the plow, if I can call the plow a kind of industrialization, mechanized, whatever, that we want to kind of create a balance where we kind of want to bring nature into our created environment, onto our constructed environment. And so, right, and then I imagine, because we see this currently, I mean, but so I imagine it's got some anthropological roots as well. The mechanical activities of the day, as our bodies become kind of mechanized, as we're doing repetitive actions like tending to fields or hammering stuff, that we are wanting to bring nature and beauty into that. And music is a way too, right? We sing while we work, or we sing with the rhythm of our work, right? And then, maybe we could say with, classical composition that we're kind of bringing art into our kind of more analytical thinking about life, into our philosophy, into science, in some sense, right? Like to me, Bach was very much like an engineer. He was, and this is something I love about Bach, is he was an inventor, right? He was creating these such interesting musical inventions, and I see that as resonating with um, the other aspects of cultural evolution. So I feel like I almost want to say like art often has this balancing role that helps keep us in touch with beauty in the face of the kind of banality of mechanization, if that word works. Then I had a couple thoughts. Well, the idea of stealing art, I think that has to be a relatively new concept. And I mean, when did inspiration become, theft or appropriation or whatever? Does it have to do with consequences of capitalism on art? That's a big question. I won't say anything else on that, but and then the last thing I have here is the idea of from Brian Eno, that concept of scenius. You were talking, Daniel, about creativity in the group setting. The phrase came to me, global scenius, where what is it like for, I mean, we're already to some extent in a world of global scenius. Anime can be an example of that. But like I guess where my mind is wanting to go is like questions like it, how does art fit into global pluralism, right? What does it? Because I want to. I think it's like not just fusions of aesthetics, because we already have a lot of that. And that does, I mean, you can love curry and hate Indian people, right? This is the aesthetic appropriations do not mean that there's like a pluralistic vibe happening. So can there be an artistic representation of something like global pluralism that yeah, I don't know. I'm just at the edge of my thoughts with that one. But anyway.
No, I love that thought right there. I mean, for me, and I'll give it to Michael here, and then if anyone has any final things, I alas will have obligations this evening. But in a little bit, I think for me, like on that question, I see art as expanding the horizons of rationality. And if actually encountering the girdle point, as we've talked about, is very important for global pluralism, I think art, and certainly under the wing, the short stories we do there, we are always circling stories that have to deal with encounters with the girdle point, where people are actually reaching this incompletion in their map, and they either have to choose the girdle point and dwell in it, which requires great vulnerability, great sacrifice, and great difficulty, or use the indestructibility of their map to keep out the other once and for all. And that's kind of an absolute choice that characters can make, and showing that I think can actually help us understand the temptations and tendencies in global pluralism, which also get into topics like geopedia, the algorithmic that we've talked about. And I think art actually, if it is done properly, can actually be in service of helping us understand things like the girdle point. And actually, I think there's a lot of great story and great movies and great work to be done that really understands the problem of internally consistent systems, and actually is showing characters caught in that, encountering one another. I do think Attack on Titan is a great example of that in anime. I actually think animes and mangas have been more likely to tell this kind of story for an extended period of time, and the paper kind of gets into that. But maybe not entirely owned as well as it could be. But I think that question you just asked is fantastic. I'm now also, yeah, it's very interesting how kids dance. Like I look at my own kids. Yeah, it is very interesting how there is almost a sense in which kids are naturally living in a manner that is waiting for something to come before the eyes. Like their experience, there's a kind of experience of going around until something grabs them and now they're making a fort, right? And we lose that as we get older. That actually we need to be able to keep that. And it also makes me think of how Chesterton in the beginning of Everlasting Man was like, when we ask about what is prehistoric man, you get all these images of a hunter and people throwing spears and all that different stuff. He's like, no, I mean, from all we know, they were artists. They really like painting caves. It's like we know that, prehistoric man was an artist. And it's just very interesting how we lose that. I think you're correct that there is actually something about a longing to bring, dare I say, the technical and the aesthetic together, and to actually have them fold into one another. And knowing how to do that is tricky, but but it's very important. I like global scenus. That's grand. That's really nice. I will pause and throw it to Michael here. Michael, good to have you, sir. Thank you for coming.
Good to be here. Yeah, I have a couple things that have just been on my mind throughout this conversation. One of them on the discussion around stealing versus, I guess the kind of alternative that I was hearing is like yes-anding. Like instead of merely just ripping someone off and replicating, like taking an idea and then kind of integrating it with your own thought and seeing how that resonates, and what can be added to it. It makes me think I'm very fortunate enough to be in this poetry workshop group that meets weekly. And one thing that we've noticed time and time again is how on a lot of weeks that we'll meet, a lot of our poems will have like exactly the same ideas or symbols or images or content. Like I was just listening to your recent conversation, Daniel, with Aspasia and Seth, and Seth brought in like conceptual rhyming, the idea that like concepts and ideas can rhyme with each other. And that's something that we see like all the time in this group is like, 1 week there will be odes to the natural world, and it won't just be like the natural world, it'd be like birds. And sometimes it's like the same birds multiple people talk about, and there's this kind of like weird telepathic thing going on. Or another thing that will happen is someone will write a poem on a certain topic, and then the next week someone will be inspired to write their own on that thing. Yeah, exactly. Sheldrick is proud. I just had this experience recently. Someone who I met on Substack, who's a poet, she's putting together this 10-page chapbook of poems on the passing of her father. And she asked me to be one of the editors, the reviewers of it. And I was just really moved by these poems and wrote one on my father. And it wasn't, I wasn't stealing or really borrowing in terms of like the stylistic, like technical parts of the poem, but the ideas and the sentiments shared and her perspective, her perspectival orientation towards it were things that I was inspired by. But inspiration feels quite different than, like, to say I'm inspired by someone to write something feels quite different than I replicated or I stole, or the kind of Tarantino advice, right? I think that's more looking into stylistic choices. pay attention to the way that this Dall-E shot is performed, and then try and I think that that's important. Like, I think the idea that authenticity is downstream from imitation, I think is true. But I think their inspiration is acting on a different level of it's acting on a more fundamental level, it feels like a spiritual core at the strike of beauty, right? And I just the last thing, and I'll pass it back. I don't know if any of you followed that court case earlier this year with Ed Sheeran, where he was accused by the writer of "Let's Get It On" by Marvin Gaye of basically copying the melody of the song. And he went like, in the court case, he goes up and he plays multiple songs of his, I think on guitar or on piano, I can't remember. And he's basically like, guys, there are like fundamental building blocks that exist in basically every single pop song. Like, if you want to accuse me of ripping this song off, go after literally every single living and dead singer. And so and I think that's true across mediums. I think, it's like, okay, so like everyone who's written, a poem that has an A-B, iambic pentameter rhyme scheme, like, okay, so like that, yeah, you're a thief. Like, there are certain structures, like, of artistic expression that have just been like repeated and proven to work in a certain fashion. And I think that's, there's stealing of ideas, and there's mere mimesis of structure, right? Like, I mean, it's the same in the natural world. Animals and plants mimic, other and evolve from other organisms, because there's a certain essence of, survival that and thriving and adapting in an environment that is able to be replicated, and should be, for like the proliferation of species. And I think the same is in art. There's certain, the 5-act story structure is a certain tried and true method of writing a story, and merely adopting that skeleton is not the same as stealing. So yeah, I just thought that would be an interesting thing to throw in the conversation.
Yeah, that court case is hilarious. It's like, but come on, man, he used a cowbell, and it's so obvious he stole the cowbell. I mean, where else would you get it from Marvin Gaye? But I don't actually think, it speaks to. But hey, if truth is relative, then there are no absolutes of art. Like, I don't think that's by chance. Like, if it's all just preference, then when you appeal to some sort of, well, no, there are like, structures that are real in art. Well, no, they're not. Actually, for me, like, there is a funny way. Yeah, we stole them from cows. That was so cruel. There is a way in which actually arts. It's very interesting to me. I would have to expand on. I'll throw it to Jockin here. And then if anyone has any final things, is that art, far from art, always to me being a testament to relativism, as some people claim, and that's just as kind of popularly claimed. I always found art was actually kind of like really strong evidence that it wasn't all relative, right? That there was a conditional, there was a personal element, but you can't just make anything go and it be a work of art that people want to read, right? That depends. But yes, the very fact that there are like structures in reality. I think the last thing I'll say is that when you're talking about the inspiration and being moved to writing something from the poetry you read, that to me, I'm always interested by inspiration, because I guess also in this paper on Japan and Unleashing Story, to me, there's a unique connection between story and inspiration. Because when you hear somebody's story and you're moved by it, then you're inspired to create. Like, what inspires you? Like I find that people, when they're inspired by music, the music makes them recall something. They associate with something that is more storied, right? Like that inspiration and inspiration and a feeling of meaning kind of go together. That inspiration tends to have some sort of appeal to story. some sort of appeal to something that then makes you go out and make music, makes you go out and paint and different things. So to me, it's interesting to think of story and inspiration, those things. And then, of course, if story unlocks rationality, inspiration unlocks rationality. And if inspiration is the very coming before the eyes, and that unlocks inspiration, then and that unlocks rationality, then a society that lacks story may lack the coming before the eyes of which makes it human. But I'll pause and give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
To pick up what's been said by a couple of people. I mean, first of all, the idea of like, will we do art if no suffering existed? I'm very suspicious of that. I think the answer is no. Partly because what art is meant to do is the tending to the encounter of limit, and pain is limit. So basically, if we get the third impact, there is no limit. Everything's just all one Borg all together. Yeah, shout outs to their paper. There would be no art making. So there's something about, right, the human as the encounter of limit, thinking about limit, I'll call it, and retroactively thinking about the limit. That's, I think, an important detail, which, by the way, is what the bring before the eyes does. It actually does. It's the encounter of the limit and seeing the exceeding of it, and seeing things that are thought to be unrelated to become unified under a new relationship you didn't see before. And that's the first one. Second one is the idea of, this idea of intellectual property. Massive. It does seem like a very massive double-edged sword. That what used to be of the culture is what we all drew from, right? And wow, we basically have that with the public domain, the public domain, that things are allowed to be contained within a certain artist or person origin, and then it's agreed that it has to be released. You have to release it from your own capture of it for the good of society. That's a very interesting point, because that's also usually, I think, the big attenuation of homages, allegory, versus straight up stealing is acknowledgement. I think a lot of this, it really is the acknowledgement of the other. No, like the whole point of that, when no one gets upset when you're in a shared space of inspiration, right, of friends working together, or as Luber brought up, like me and you riffing on ideas together. There's no one being ownership of it, because we have it together. We're encountering it together and working on it together. It's just part of this is because of a mode of, we see examples of it in science where there's this rush of ownership of ideas, and you got to be the first to get to it. And actually, that's been a lot of the model of intellectual. This is partly why the academic space doesn't work, because it's based on an idea of individuated knowledge generation, that we have to be a sole genius who has to figure it out ourselves, and we got to claim it all to ourselves. If we disclose it to anybody, nope, it's no longer ours. And we don't get the credit, and we don't get the money, and we don't get the rights to it. That is not exactly the most conducive environments for this kind of collaborative space or generation of new insight, which will affect what kind of art you make. And generally in the art practice, this is usually why, at the minimum, it's definitely important you have to always cite your sources. You're permitted to use other people's work with an acknowledgement. You have to acknowledge it. The one note it's very important to bring up is an area that's been in contention since about since the fountain, right, of Duchamp, of what's called the recontextualization activity of art. Meaning, what Duchamp did was he took a urinal, and because he put it in a new context in a new location, and he presented a claim of this is what art is now. It's by a statement of recontextualization. There is no need for generation of new work or technical skill. I could just impose by fiat, and that gives a new context. So that's obviously very deconstructive, and it's been interpreted that way. The more positive way to frame it, I bring this up and say here, is there's a general acknowledgement of things like hip hop and ciphers and things like that, where the inspiration, the basically recontextualization of prior work in a new context it's a justification for art. The whole concept of graphic design is based on this premise, meaning we can take assets from other places and think in different contexts and arrange them together in a new arrangement and give a new value. So it's actually based on Duchamp's fountain. So that's actually the positive stance of that deconstructionist move of what Duchamp did. But it's important, because that's generally one of the tensions, is that now you're using other people's work to generate a new insight, and that value generation or point of bringing before the eyes is a new context that didn't exist before. So, and that gets a little complicated because things like royalty rights and things like that. But anyways, I think that's worth sharing. But I want to circle back to the larger point of encounter of limit. It's what art does. And generally the tension we're running into now, a little bit in the arts or in the creative fields, is this idea of, will we be able to do genius thought? Basically, will we get sole genius by their own individual thought and activity? They're going to create the new insights that bring before the eyes, new possibility. I say no. I don't think that's going to happen. But everything in our structures are very much geared on that presumption. And I'll close on that.
No, magnificent. I appreciate everyone being here today. I will have to run here. No, I think, yeah, the whole academic, be the first one, don't have your ideas stolen. This has absolutely killed creativity. That certain nervousness. I understand it, where people's career and money making and all that are in trouble. But to me, also that nervousness of having your ideas taken it also speaks to a certain lack of confidence. Because you're like, if I lose this idea, then I'll never have another good idea, right? Like when you see like Bernard would always talk about in the hip hop cipher, it's like, yeah, you just take it, right? Because you're confident you'll have another idea, right? You're confident you'll have more, right? You're not so nervous. But here's the irony. If you have a society that's nervous about not having good idea, of having its ideas stolen, then you don't speak with other people about ideas, and therefore you don't have new ideas with them. Therefore, the ideas you have are the only ones you have, and so you get a death spiral. You get an anti-creative death spiral. So it's a major problem. You need a culture of sharing ideas freely, and then people won't be so nervous about their ideas being taken because they become good at having ideas. But if they're not doing that because of the culture, copyright, blah, 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 it's a major problem. I do agree that basically much of it comes down to acknowledgement. If one acknowledges their sources, acknowledges their different things, for me, that's the proper honoring, because otherwise, in a sense, you are contributing to the lie or the problematic notion of the isolated genius, right? Like acknowledgement actually is speaking to the truth of how creativity is birthed. And you find your voice in the history of voices. And if you don't acknowledge that, if you don't acknowledge the other voices by which you found your voice, there's a way in which it's just simply not true. But again, if people are nervous that they're not seen as a genius, or they're nervous that their good idea will be taken, or their good idea won't be seen as a good idea, then this leads to strategies of not wanting to claim you got inspired from others, not wanting to claim that you had any, inspiration from other people's ideas. And that precisely what you fear is what comes unto you. If you have a culture that is afraid that it won't ever have good ideas again, and if their good ideas are stolen, then that's it. If people are afraid of not being creative, then they won't be creative, because what you fear is what comes unto you. And I think we see that in the culture. I think also what you're saying about coming before the eyes and encountering limit is very good. I think that also is Hegelian. The encounter of limit then is kind of the bringing forth. And I think also, well, coming before the eyes and suffering go together. Like what comes before your eyes is contingent upon what you are willing to suffer. I think if you're not willing to suffer, then you can't actually have the affordances by which things can come before your eyes, right? Because also, too, what comes before your eyes, if it is, a determination, it just comes forward, it puts a choice on you. You now have to choose. What am I going to do in response to this thing that has come before the eyes? And in my experience, often what comes before the eyes can demand something of you, well, then that will call you forth, and that in of itself will entail suffering. But then, of course, that's why a perfect world won't have art, because if art actually is training and coming before the eyes, but there's no suffering, well, then nothing comes before the eyes, which seems like paradise, but actually that's locked from the inside. More to be said, but I've certainly appreciated this evening. Thank you all for being here, gentlemen, and may you have a delightful rest of the day. Thank you. All the best. All the best to you.